All right, welcome everybody to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something I think we all struggle with sometimes. You know, that feeling of just being mentally confused,
Yeah.
like just not being able to think straight. We're going to be looking at this from all angles, pulling from some really cool cutting edge neuroscience and cognitive science research, but also some ancient wisdom.
Yeah, Vedic traditions.
Right. And our expert today is, well, an expert in both of those areas.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to dive in.
So, I guess the goal today is to really try to get a handle on like what is actually happening in the brain when we feel mentally confused?
Right.
Like, is there something going on that we can point to? And then the even more interesting part,
Yeah.
what are some things we can do about it, both from a, modern scientific approach,
Right.
but also maybe some of these more ancient practices, like
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
do they have some solutions that maybe even science is now starting to kind of rediscover?
Absolutely. And I think that's what we'll find as we go along.
Okay, cool. So let's start with, I guess, the basics. When you talk about mental confusion, what are we really even talking about here?
Well, I think everybody's felt it, right? It's that feeling of maybe you can't focus, you're
Mm.
forgetful,
Right.
things feel foggy, you know?
Yeah, like you can't quite grasp a thought or
Exactly.
make a decision.
Yeah, and sometimes it can be kind of situational, right? Like if you're in a really complex situation, like trying to follow complicated instructions,
Right.
or maybe you're sleep deprived.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But sometimes it can be, more persistent thing, which can be worrisome. So,
Right.
so we're really trying to get to the bottom of, like, what are the mental processes,
Yeah.
but also what's happening in the brain? What are the neural underpinnings of that experience?
Right, and we've got this concept of cognitive overload, which I think is
Yeah,
a big part of it, right?
it's a huge part of it. Yeah,
It sounds like, the information equivalent of trying to stuff 10 pounds of, stuff into a 5-pound bag.
that's a great analogy.
Hmm.
Our brains,
Right.
especially the working memory, that part of our brain that kind of holds information actively so we can use it,
Right.
it has very limited capacity.
Right.
So it's almost like you've only got a few mental slots.
Yeah.
And if you try and cram too much in,
Right.
things get jumbled up, you drop things.
It all spills out. Yeah. And that can lead to what some of the sources called information paralysis,
Right. Exactly.
which sounds scary. Like, is that literally like you can like,
Well, it's not like you're completely frozen,
okay.
but it is that feeling where, thinking feels slow,
Huh?
effortful.
Right.
It's hard to make a decision
Mhm.
because you've got all this information, but you can't sort through it effectively.
Yeah.
It's like, you've got all the ingredients for a meal,
Right.
but you don't know what recipe to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't decide. And how does that relate to this more everyday term that I think a lot of people have heard of, brain fog?
Well, brain fog it's not really a medical term,
Oh.
but it's kind of a catch-all phrase that people use
Right.
when they're experiencing, trouble concentrating,
Right.
forgetfulness, just that overall feeling of being mentally sluggish.
Right. Yeah.
And a lot of times, the root cause of that is cognitive overload.
Okay.
So, it's like,
It's like the symptom of.
yeah, it's kind of the subjective experience
Yeah.
of that underlying process.
Okay. So what kinds of things, like what triggers this overload? I mean, is it just that we have, a busy life or a lot on our minds?
Well, it's certainly part of it,
Okay.
but they're both, external things and internal things that can contribute.
Yeah.
So on the external side, if you think about just the amount of information that we're bombarded with daily,
Right.
especially in the digital age, like just,
Right.
the constant notifications, the news cycles, social
Right.
media,
Right.
all of that can contribute to overload. Then you add in multitasking, which, a lot of people think they're good at, but research actually shows
Yeah.
that it's really not very efficient.
Right.
And then, of course, stress is a huge factor.
Yeah, for
Right.
sure.
So all of those things can kind of push the brain beyond its capacity to process.
Right.
But then internally, even, maybe your external environment isn't that chaotic.
Right.
If you've got like a lot of worries
Right.
or your mind's just racing with thoughts,
Yeah.
that internal noise can be just as overwhelming.
Right. Right. And I mean, it sounds like this isn't just an annoyance. Like the Mayo Clinic even mentioned that. Like this can lead to feeling frustrated, detached, even like having trouble making decisions.
Absolutely. Because, your brain is so overwhelmed,
Yeah.
it can't even do the basic functions
Yeah.
of, regulating your emotions or
Right.
making clear choices.
Okay. So we know that this is happening.
All right.
But what's actually happening in the brain when this is going on?
Well, a lot of the research is focused on, the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like the executive center of the brain,
Right.
right behind your forehead.
Yeah.
And that's involved in, planning, decision-making, working memory, all the things that are kind of impaired when we're confused.
Right.
And what they find is that when we're in a state of cognitive overload,
Yeah.
the activity in that prefrontal cortex, it's like it gets overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's like, too many signals firing at once, and it can't keep up.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like, what does that look like practically? Like, if, say, I'm trying to listen to you explain this,
Right.
but I'm also, looking at my phone trying to do two things at once.
Well, what's interesting is they've done studies with, brain imaging,
Right.
where they actually can see that when you try to divide your attention like that,
Right.
the neural representations in your prefrontal cortex,
Okay.
they become less distinct. So it's almost like the signal for each task
Right.
gets weaker. And that's why, you're more likely to make mistakes.
Okay.
You're more likely to forget things because your brain just can't
Right.
hold on to both of those things clearly.
Right.
It's like trying to, listen to two different songs at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It just becomes a jumbled mess.
Right. And neuroscientists sometimes use this term signal-to-noise ratio.
Okay.
So it's like, when you're trying to focus on something,
Right.
there's the signal, which is the information you want.
Right.
But then there's all this other noise going on in the brain.
Yeah.
And when you're confused, it's like that signal-to-noise ratio is
Yeah.
really low. The noise is drowning out the signal.
Okay. So it's not just how much information,
Right.
but it's also like the quality or the type of information.
Exactly. So,
Ah.
we talked about cognitive overload,
Right.
but you can also have confusion that arises because the information you're receiving is contradictory. Or it's incomplete. So, like, you're missing crucial details.
Yeah.
And that makes it hard for the brain to kind of, create a coherent picture.
Yeah.
So, for example, imagine, you're given instructions for a task.
Right.
But those instructions conflict with something you learned previously.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're just, like, vague,
Right.
and you don't have enough information to actually carry out the task.
Okay.
You're going to feel confused,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And so, in that case, it's not overload.
Right.
It's that the information itself
Right.
is creating this kind of dissonance in your mind.
So what does the brain do when that happens? Like, does it just sort of shut down? Or does it try to...
Well, the brain doesn't like uncertainty,
Okay.
so it will try to resolve that conflict.
Okay.
It'll try to either find more information
Right.
or it'll try to kind of rationalize it somehow.
Okay.
But if it can't do that, that's when you're left feeling confused.
Okay. So now let's talk about attention and memory, because it sounds like those are also like really key players in this whole confusion game.
They're absolutely central. So attention,
Yeah.
it's our ability to kind of select what we focus on
Right.
and filter out distractions.
Yeah.
And when our attention is scattered,
Right.
or we're trying to multitask,
Yeah.
which, as we said, isn't very effective,
Right.
that's when we're much more likely to feel confused
Okay.
because our brain's not really processing anything.
Right. Right. It's like trying to have, 5 conversations at once.
Right.
You're not really listening to any of them.
And there's actually research that shows that
Yeah.
when you have high attentional demands,
All right.
so you're trying to do a lot of things at once,
Right.
your working memory capacity actually decreases.
Oh, wow.
So you literally can't hold on to as much information.
Okay. And then memory itself, there's like 2 sides to that, right?
Yeah.
There's the working memory, that short-term stuff, and then there's our long-term memory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So working memory, we said it's limited.
Yeah.
It's like a little mental scratch pad.
Right.
And if you try to put too much on it, things get confused.
Right.
You might misremember things.
Yeah.
Mix things up. And this is especially true for, information that's similar.
Right. Right. Like trying to, remember 5 different but similar passwords.
Exactly. And long-term memory plays a role too.
Okay.
Because if you're trying to learn something new
Right.
and it either conflicts with something you already know
Okay.
or you don't have any existing knowledge to kind of connect it to
Yeah.
you're going to feel confused.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's interesting is there's a part of the brain called the hippocampus,
Right.
which is really important for memory.
Okay.
And they found that when people are trying to remember something,
Yeah.
sometimes the hippocampus will generate like multiple possible matches.
Okay.
But if you don't have enough context or cues
Right.
to know which one's the right one,
Right.
you're left feeling confused.
Interesting. So Now, this is where it gets really interesting because one of the sources pointed out that, like, confusion itself isn't necessarily always a bad thing.
Right.
Like, it can actually be a sign that your brain is, like, engaged in something complex.
It's like a productive state.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is particularly true in learning.
Okay.
So they call it an epistemic emotion, meaning
Okay.
it's an emotion that arises when you're, like, grappling with knowledge.
Okay.
And so that feeling of, wait a minute, I don't get this,
Right.
it can actually motivate you to, like, dig deeper, ask questions,
Okay.
and ultimately you end up with a deeper understanding.
Okay. So, like, it's a sign that your brain is, like,
Yeah,
trying to make sense of something.
exactly. It's like a signal that, hey, we need to pay more attention here.
Right.
We need to put in some more effort.
Okay. So it's not always a bad thing, but I guess it can tip over, right?
All right.
If it becomes too much.
Yeah.
Like, if it's so overwhelming that it's...
Yeah, if it leads to, like, complete shutdown,
Right.
then it's obviously not helpful.
Okay. So what does this all look like in the brain? Like, when we're feeling confused, are there, like, specific things happening?
Yeah, they're starting to actually be able to see this with brain imaging.
Okay.
So, for example, one study they did, they used EEG, which measures electrical activity in the brain.
Right.
They had people doing math problems,
Okay.
and they would give them problems where there was missing information.
Okay.
And what they found was that when people were confused, there was actually a decrease in what's called alpha wave power in the parts of the brain involved in that task.
Okay.
And that decrease actually indicates that those brain regions are working harder.
Oh, so it's not like it's shutting down. It's actually...
It's trying to compensate. It's trying to, like,
Right.
where's that missing information? How do we make sense of this?
Okay, so it's almost like it revs up the engine. Okay. And what about mental clarity? Like, what's the opposite of that look like?
Well, mental clarity is associated with, more efficient, more organized brain activity.
Okay.
So, instead of that, like, frantic searching,
Right.
it's more like everything's flowing smoothly.
Okay.
And there's one really cool study they did where they used this thing called fMRI neurofeedback,
Okay.
where they can actually, like, show people their brain activity in real time
Wow.
and train them to kind of, like, improve the signal-to-noise ratio.
Okay.
And what they found was that when people did this,
Yeah.
their brain activity became less noisy, more sharply tuned,
Okay.
and they actually performed better on tasks.
Wow. So they were literally able to, like...
Yeah, it was almost like digitally remastering the brain,
Wow.
to be clear.
Okay, that's amazing. And, we talked about stress earlier.
Right.
And it makes sense that, like, if you're chronically stressed,
Yeah.
that's going to contribute to confusion.
Absolutely.
So what's happening there?
Well, they find that with chronic stress, brain networks become less efficient.
Okay.
So the brain has to work harder to do the same things.
Right.
And the communication between different brain regions
Yeah.
gets disrupted. It's like, if you have a team that's not communicating well,
Right.
things are going to fall apart.
Yeah.
But when people recover from stress
Yeah.
or engage in things that calm the mind,
Right.
you see these brain networks becoming more synchronized,
Okay.
more coherent.
Interesting.
And, specifically chronic stress releases cortisol, which can actually damage the hippocampus, which is
Yeah.
important for memory,
Right.
and it can impair prefrontal cortex function, which is important for attention.
Okay.
So reducing stress is really key for clarity.
It's all connected, right?
Exactly.
So what's really fascinating is that, like, these modern scientific findings about confusion, they actually seem to echo a lot of what ancient traditions, like in India,
Yeah, the Vedic traditions.
Yeah, they've been saying for centuries.
Right, because these traditions, they've always recognized that the mind can be both our greatest ally and our greatest enemy.
Right.
And so they developed all these practices
Yeah.
to kind of train the mind,
Right.
and cultivate clarity.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, I think one of the most well-known is meditation,
Okay.
or in Sanskrit, dhyana.
Right.
And, a lot of people think of meditation as just like relaxation.
Right.
But in these traditions, it's really about much more than that. It's about cultivating a state of clarity, of insight.
Right.
And there are many different techniques,
Okay.
but they all involve essentially training the mind to let go of distractions
Right.
and focus on one thing.
Okay.
So you might focus on your breath. You might focus on a mantra, which is a sacred sound,
Right.
or you might visualize something.
Right.
But the key is to
Okay.
keep bringing your attention back to that object of focus.
Okay.
because our minds tend to wander.
Right. Right.
So it's that training, that discipline
Right.
that helps to kind of settle the mind.
Right. And there's this beautiful analogy in the Bhagavad Gita about like a steady lamp in a windless place.
Right.
And I think that really captures that feeling of like
Absolutely.
when the mind is still and clear.
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah. So meditation is like the actual technique, but also the state, it sounds like.
Right. It's both the practice
Okay.
and the goal.
Okay. And what did these traditions say about like how meditation actually works to reduce confusion?
Well, they talk about this concept of avidya, which is ignorance or misperception.
Okay.
And they saw confusion as kind of a symptom of that,
Okay.
meaning we're confused because we're not seeing things clearly.
Yeah. Right.
And so meditation is a way to kind of break through that,
Okay.
to directly experience a quieter, more clear mind.
Right.
And they would say that, if you're feeling confused,
Yeah.
just sit and observe your mind.
Yeah.
Don't try to fight the thoughts.
Right.
Just watch them come and go.
Right.
And eventually they'll settle.
Okay. So it's like almost like letting the mud settle in the water.
Exactly. A beautiful analogy.
Yeah. And it's amazing how much research now supports this idea of meditation for clarity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, we talked about how attention is so important for clarity.
Right.
And studies show that meditation can actually improve attention.
Okay.
Both, the ability to focus
Yeah.
and the ability to, notice when your mind wanders and bring it back.
Right.
And they've even shown that long-term meditators
Yeah.
have structural changes in their brains.
Okay.
So they have increased thickness
Yeah.
in parts of the brain associated with attention.
So it's like they're literally...
Yeah, it's like they're building up that attention muscle.
Okay, that's cool.
And then for memory, they've shown that meditation can increase gray matter in the hippocampus.
Oh, wow.
Which we said is that crucial area for memory.
Right.
And it also reduces cortisol, which is the stress hormone.
Right.
Which can impair memory.
Okay. So it's like a double whammy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, the American Psychological Association, they even list improved concentration and mental clarity as benefits of mindfulness meditation.
Okay.
So it's really, it's not just some woo-woo thing.
Right.
It's actually like a very practical tool.
So what's the advice then? Like, how much should people meditate?
Well, traditionally, they recommend meditating daily, even if it's just for 10 or 20 minutes.
Okay.
And then, also to use it in moments of confusion.
Okay.
So, if you're feeling overwhelmed,
Yeah.
just take a few minutes to sit and breathe.
Okay. So it's like a preventative measure, but also
Yeah.
kind of like a first aid.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Now, let's talk about pranayama, which is
Right.
breath regulation.
Right.
So how does that tie into mental clarity?
So, in yogic traditions, the breath is seen as like this bridge between the body and the mind.
Okay.
And they believe that, when the mind is agitated,
Yeah.
the breath is also erratic.
Right.
And conversely, when the breath is calm,
Yeah.
the mind also tends to calm down.
Okay.
So pranayama is really about using the breath to kind of regulate the mental state.
Okay.
And there are many different techniques, but
Yeah.
for confusion and anxiety,
Okay.
they often recommend slow, deep breathing
Okay.
because that activates the parasympathetic nervous system,
Right.
which is our rest and digest response.
Yeah.
And that kind of counteracts the stress response,
Okay.
which is associated with, that fight or flight
Right.
when the mind's racing.
Okay. Okay.
And, there's a saying in yoga, prana and mind move together.
Okay.
So prana being that life force energy,
Right.
that's also connected to the breath.
Okay.
So they really saw this as like a very direct way to influence the mind.
So if you're feeling confused, what kind of pranayama would you recommend?
Well, there are many different techniques,
Okay.
but one simple one is like a 4-count inhale,
Okay.
2-count hold, okay, 6 to 8 count exhale.
Okay.
And just doing that a few times can really help to kind of reset the nervous system.
Okay. And bring that calmness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, they also use pranayama as preparation for meditation.
Okay.
So it's almost like, you calm the mind down with the breath first,
Right.
and then you can go deeper into meditation.
Okay. And does science have anything to say about this?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
So they've done studies showing that, slow diaphragmatic breathing
Right.
can reduce stress hormones.
Okay.
It can increase heart rate variability,
Okay.
which is a sign of like a healthy, balanced nervous system.
Okay.
They've even shown that it can improve executive functions.
Okay.
So things like decision-making, working memory, all the things that are impaired when we're confused.
Yeah. And they used to think this was all just like relaxation, right?
Right.
But it sounds like it's actually much more than that.
It's much more sophisticated than that, yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about mantras now.
Yeah.
Those are like the sacred sounds, right?
Yeah, so mantras they can be words or phrases,
Okay.
but they're considered sacred in these traditions,
Right.
and they're used as a tool for meditation.
Okay.
So the idea is that by repeating a mantra,
Yeah.
either silently or aloud,
Right.
you kind of focus the mind
Okay.
and you quiet down all the mental chatter.
Okay.
So it's almost like, giving the mind a job to do,
Right.
and it prevents it from wandering off into all these confusing thoughts.
Okay. So it's like a focal point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Vedic view is that like sound itself has power.
Okay.
So that these mantras, they actually create certain vibrations
Okay.
that can influence our mental state.
Okay. So they're not just words. They're
No, they're considered like energetic tools.
okay.
So for example, the mantra Om,
Yeah.
which is probably the most well-known,
Yeah.
it's considered the primordial sound,
Okay.
the sound of creation.
Yeah.
And they believe that chanting Om
Yeah.
creates this calming resonance in the body and mind.
Interesting.
And people who practice mantra repetition, they often report feeling, more peaceful,
Right.
more centered.
Okay. So what does science have to say about this?
Well, there's actually been some really interesting research on mantra chanting.
Okay.
So they did a study using fMRI, which measures brain activity.
Right.
And they found that chanting Om
Okay.
actually activates parts of the brain involved in regulating emotions,
Okay.
like the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And it deactivates parts of the limbic system,
Okay.
which is involved in like fear and stress.
Okay.
So specifically the amygdala, which is like our fear center, it actually quiets down during Om chanting.
Wow.
And they even found that this effect is similar to what you see with vagus nerve stimulation.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, it's actually inducing this relaxation response in the brain.